Thank you so much for also for attending. I'm always really excited to be able to share what I do with a group of people because it gives us a chance to learn about what we might not know we're interested in yet. And it always gives me a chance to look back on what's brought me to where I am. So one of the things that I like to start out with is I like to talk about my obsessions. So some of the things that I'm really drawn to that you'll see throughout the presentation that comes up again and again with my work in different mediums, in different formats, through different tactics, things like shelters, dwellings, architectural elements are really exciting to me. I have a really deep relationship with survival skills, and I look at that through a casual familial lens. So survival skills as in my family are homesteaders, and both my grandmothers felled their own homesteads with their partners. So that's something that's been a really interesting aspect for me to learn about in relationship to architecture as well. I look at research and history a lot, and that relates back to some of the occupations that I've had that Christine mentioned. I work really closely with archives. Part of my interest in working with history, research, and archives is also unpacking that material. What I mean by that is that history can often be presented through a very particular lens. And what I'm interested in is looking at what is not represented as much as what is represented in history. I love old books. I'm a bookbinder. I grew up surrounded by books. So you'll see that as a really intrinsic part of what drew me to printmaking. I teach with Emily Carr University as a printmaker and a bookbinder. But that's always part of how I'm looking at the world around me. And then, of course, print, collage, and drawing. Even though some of my work has gone to different extremes, like performance, it always comes back to a place and a fundamental interest in print, collage, and drawing. And I'm actually going to start talking about some of my previous works by sharing some drawings. These are pieces that were brought to fruition in about 2013. And what I've been interested in with architectural dwellings and shelters is the idea of how do we take materials that we look at in the world around us and do quite fantastic things with them. So I consider my grandmothers to be kind of like the original survivalists. They looked at land that was not developed, and they said not only can we create a living out of this, but we can turn that natural resource into a home that we will then raise, on my paternal side, 9 children in. And so part of what I've been looking at with taking the idea of historical homesteading and historical survivalism is bringing it into a more contemporary moment where we're looking at the idea of homesteading or terraforming in the future. So if we look at things like planetary development, survivalism, if we think about the conditions that we're looking at right now, we're thinking about things like what does it look like if we start to look at Mars? What does it look like if we have dwellings or things that have to travel in space? And so taking familial and familiar architecture, like barns, houses, and taking them to a place where they start to represent something that's maybe like a crystalline structure, or something that becomes a hybrid vehicle of both home and vehicle, dwelling, spaceship. And some of the things and the tricks that have allowed me to do this with my drawing is by looking at ways that we've built architecture as beacons, survivalist architecture that allows us a way to think about 2 major elements that come up in my work, and that's prospect and refuge. So prospect is the idea of looking out, surveying the landscape, seeing what we can observe. Whereas refuge is what provides us with security, is really a fundamental tenet of the idea of shelters. So I'm interested in things that operate in both of those realms, so things like lighthouses, survival shelters that are in different cultures, ranger stations, things that have allowed us an opportunity to look out, but to also feel like we're protected from the elements. So this series of drawings range from, this size is about 1.5 feet by 2 feet, whereas the first drawing was 5.5 feet by 6 feet. So some of them are quite large. They're meant to have a scaled body relationship, whereas some of them, when the scale is smaller, are really meant to be about the idea of a shelter. And so I'm working with scale to develop some of those concepts. This is one of the last images of the drawings that I'll share, and this I think is maybe where you can start to see some of the farm-based architecture that I'm really working from. This is a barn that was on one of my family's original homesteads. And I'm really curious what happens when architecture moves from contemporary to historical to ruin. And that's something that's been a part of how I'm looking at collage as well. Some of the artists that I'm really interested in terms of how they deal with ideas of shelter, Tracey Emin's work has this really interesting way of situating familiar materials in an unfamiliar space. So when you're in a gallery, a white-walled, pristine space, the kind of boards that she's using, the used materials that feel like they have a patina and a life, really take on a different character. If you're familiar with Tracey Emin's work, she also does a series of tent works where she embroiders names of all the people that she's ever slept with on the interior of the tent. And it looks like a very normal camping tent on the exterior. And so part of what I'm really curious about with her work is how she's developing a psychology around the architecture that she's looking at. Somebody that I am super curious about, particularly on the West Coast, is Lloyd Kahn. Lloyd Kahn is what you would maybe call a bespoke builder. And he's been brought in a bunch of different areas, particularly around the islands, to build homes, small structures in particular, from and of the material that is on the land, on situ. So he works specifically with timbers that are found on site, rocks that are found on site, and he works with the people who will actually end up living within the home to really develop something that is of and about the character of the homeowner. And what I'm interested in about his structure, what I'm interested in about his structures as well, is that if we think back to some of the drawings that I'm making as well, there's this quality of a beacon, but also a lighthouse to this. There's a tall structure, the idea of observation, of being able to see in the round. And so I've been super curious about how he's developing a lot of the same tactics that I'm using within art making in a more pure architectural way. And then last but not least, some of the stuff that I'm really excited about in terms of shelters that exist in other places in the world. This is the Kvavlova emergency shelter in northern Norway. And what I was super excited about with this is that in terms of building little space capsules, of looking at how do we think about shelters and architecture in a more contemporary way, a lot of what that means is looking at structures and really looking at it from a minimal lens. How do we take away some of the things that bring very specific character to architecture and look at the basic shapes? And what I was super excited about with this particular emergency shelter is how it operates. We can very easily imagine it as space pod and very easily as survival shelter in the same token. If we were to replace the material of this shelter with something that felt more of space travel, we can very easily go to a place where science fiction becomes what we envision here. Some of the people who have also addressed, I ease into this gently. I really enjoy science fiction. And sometimes that's a tough sell within the contemporary art world. And so for me, what I like to do is introduce people that I'm looking at who are also very curious about the idea of interplanetary living, travel outside of our Terran culture. Adam Norton is an Australian artist who's looking at furniture and the language of the objects that we have within our home. And he's saying, how do we take from what we have around us and build the idea of what we would need to survive with? So obviously he is not going to make it super far into the post-apocalyptic future with his escape capsule, but I think there's a really interesting sense of humor that he's employing with it. I wanted to talk about some of my survival training that I've done. I had the opportunity in 2010 to work with a group called Survival Systems. And this started out from working with, when I was on the East Coast, I do a lot of scavenging. I look at thrift stores a lot. I'm really interested in Salvation Armies and sort of what kind of culture lives in the place where I am also living. And I found a series of survival manuals through the local Salvation Army that really spurned a whole trajectory of thought and was how I was able to really enter into my discovery and exploration of survivalism. So one of the ways that I was thinking about looking at that survival manual and transitioning into a more practical understanding of survivalism now was by partnering up with a group called Survival Systems. And what they do is they train people who work with the Navy SEALs, who do extreme survival scenarios, and then also folks who work on open ocean oil rigging platforms. And so you have to be able to survive very extreme scenarios, and they bring you through a 2-week session where you go from very little knowledge of what it's like to physically survive these conditions, and they train you so that you have the opportunity to understand what some of those scenarios are going to look like. It was very cold. So this is open ocean training. I was super interested in this stage of some of the ways that as a printmaker, that's where my training lies, how the idea of ritualized labor can be brought from printmaking into performance. For anybody who's ever taken a printmaking class, you know you do the same things over and over and over again. And that kind of training becomes a tacit knowledge. It's something that your body understands without having to think about it. And that's the same kind of training that Survival System provides. So I was really curious about how I could translate, like I have no problem with hard work, but I definitely don't look like somebody who's going to join the Navy SEALs. So it was a really curious combination of the kind of thinking and the work ethic that I would bring into printmaking with a very different lens than they were used to operating with. One of the more exciting moments was helicopter egress training, and what that means is they take you through a simulator of an upturned helicopter body. Helicopters are top heavy, so if they ever fall into the ocean or they crash, they're always going to flip upside down. And so what they do is they pop you in this tube, and it's on hydraulics, and they flip you upside down as you are entering the water. And you're strapped in, and they do dry runs with you, but you also have to pop open a window, because this is how you would have to actually rescue yourself, and then float to the surface, because the lovely suits that we're wearing, the Mustang suits, are flotational devices. So even if you're not able to fully understand what is top and bottom, your suit helps you. And it was fantastic to go through this with training. You can see the folks in the wetsuits are our trainers. It was a fully safe scenario. But in order to get the footage that I was looking for and the images that I was seeking out, we went through the training 8 times. And normally to get the certificates and pass the training, they do 3 sessions. And at the end of 3, they were like, okay, we get it, you can do it. And I was like, no, we're doing it again. And so it was a moment that I think was a really nice reckoning for the folks with Survival Systems to understand too, that as an artist, my work, I take it very seriously, and I'm as committed to making that and manifesting that work, and I'm willing to do what it takes to get there. And it broke down some of the barriers that existed between the kind of training and mentality that I think comes with maybe a more military focus, and for them to be able to understand that within an artistic discipline as well, when you're committed, you're committed. So this is some of a video still from the egress itself. What was also really fascinating about this experience was that they do a full immersion environment. So this is within what they call the theater. It's a huge warehouse, and the egress happens within a swimming pool. And what they do is they have a giant yoga ball that they pump on the surface of the water, so it creates a wave scenario. because when you're in the ocean, it's never calm seas when your helicopter goes down. So the other part of what they did is they created this whole sound environment, light environment. There was lightning. There were wind turbines that were blowing, so that you really could understand what surviving in an extreme scenario is really actually like. You don't have to pretend at that point. It feels very, very real. And what that moment in the training also allowed me to do is to have a really keen understanding of the fact that when you get into an extreme scenario like this, it's not just like, oh, maybe I'm gonna find some food and build a little stick hut in the woods and survive the apocalypse. It's like, no, these are very extreme, extraordinary conditions, and we're very small in the face of that kind of moment, that wrestle with nature. Out of that training, I was able to build a body of work that I shared through Eye Level Gallery. And it was a really interesting opportunity to be able to share some of the video footage that I had made, some of the objects that I was making in relationship to the idea of survivalism. And from this work, I was working with an on-site residency in a park nearby called Point Pleasant Park. And so as I was doing the survival training, I was also bringing that information back into the park scenario, which was like a little microcosm for me. What I did with a lot of the work through the park was to look at the basic tenets of survival, so food, fire, shelter, and water. And I started identifying plant species within the park that were native to that location, but also had medicinal or food-based properties to them. And I would collect in the terrarium samples of those plants and attempt to propagate. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. I was charting the plants that I was saving. So if you wanted to, you could take out a little GPS locator and you could go and find those plants within the park yourself as well. One of the things that became really clear as I was doing the survival training and also doing my own research alongside was that we have a lot of opportunities to survive without food. Life is not awful if you don't have a shelter, but one thing that's our true human limitation is our need for water. One of the things that became really interesting to me was that within the park itself, it had one source of what's considered potable or potable water. So if you did not have a city filtration system, there is one location within this entire public park area. And indeed, as the research developed, in that portion of the city of Halifax, where you could obtain drinkable water without going through iodizing tablets or a boil water advisory. The other thing that became really interesting about this is that there are communities in this country that do not have any access to drinkable water. And the trouble that one would have to go through to collect drinkable water from an available source became so much more relevant to me when you don't even have that source. So these are some of the ways that I was looking at the historical information about the park, relating it to survivalism, and then also thinking about how history and our contemporary conditions all start to feed into a really interesting cycle of information. I'm also interested in the contrast of aesthetics between the super utilitarian look and function of survival gear, and then also my history of making and how I have learned about things like craft and aesthetics within art making. So I was really interested in making these paper cuts, which were a way of me dealing with text, which I'm a super nut about, decorative elements, and also working with the color palette of survivalism. So this idea of the labor that I'm really familiar with through my grandmothers, and that meeting up against the aesthetics of survivalism. One of the other portions of this show was looking at the history of Halifax. I'm really interested in making my work relevant to where I am at the moment. Halifax has a really rich tall ship history. And so for part of the exhibition, what I was interested in doing was making shipwreck models, but using contemporary survival color palettes. So these are a series of boats that were installed within the gallery as well. The residency that I was doing at the same time that I was making this show is within the park that you can see on this map here. This is a historical map from the Nova Scotia Archives and Records Management, which is where I also have worked. And what was interesting about working with some of this material, that source of water that I was talking about, can be found right here. And so throughout the mapping history of this region, it's identified as either the well, and in some cases, the holy well. Which is very interesting when we start to think about that relationship between potable water being a life source and then giving it the moniker of something holy or designated as very special. And this is something that's existed in this part of the country since the late 1890s. So this became a really interesting way for me to fuel and funnel some of my research that I was doing about survivalism. This is the Gatekeeper's Lodge. So this is where the residency was taking place. And working with archives was a way for me to dig into the rich history of Halifax. One of the documents that I found was that very early on, when colonizers were still figuring out how they wanted to address the land that they had found, was that the park itself, while public property now, was originally designated as basically like a subdivision of privately owned plots. And so what I wanted to do was to take an image contemporary of the park, and I superimposed the subdivision plots over top of that to see like what would have been private ownership, what would have remained publicly accessible, especially when we deal on a very regular basis in this country with the idea of land ownership, land rights, and land usage. This idea of subdivision and of suburban life became really interesting for me to examine. What I did with a GPS tracker was actually demarcate one of the subdivision plots. So I went in with flagging tape after I had pinpointed the exact location, and I taped out one of the subdivision plots. The way that this worked in the park itself was that I ended up with essentially a land claim. And within that land claim, I set up a traditional British tea service, which was a way of me acknowledging that how that land is used, how it is operated, how it's maintained, has a very problematic relationship with the fact that that land is not actually ceded territory. And I think that there's ways of us having that conversation that can be about extracting some of the subtleties of what those relationships look like. So if you found me within the park, there were maps left all over. You could have a British tea service with me. I offered tours of my land plot. And you could also redirect and do your own research through the Nova Scotia Archives. They had a set of materials set aside. There are early subterranean plots. So they've found pot shards, tool shards. There's been some areas that have been explored extensively, but there's definitely evidence of pre-settler, pre-colonial activity. It's one of the things that is not as frequently discussed when we look at the history of Point Pleasant Park. That's a great question. Some of the other people that have been working with this idea of shelter, home ownership, land ownership, if you're familiar with Ken Lum's work, one of his favorite pieces that I really am drawn to is From Shangri-La to Shangri-La. If you're in Vancouver, the Shangri-La building is one of the tallest architectural structures within the city architectural developments. And what he's done is taken a set of houses that have been developed on land without permission from the city that were, in a way, they have a lot of folklore and myth around them. They were artist squats for a little while. And he's rebuilt them at a quarter scale. This is the Vancouver Art Gallery's public art pavilion within the city just off of Georgia Street. So I'm really interested about that idea of land occupation, what that means, what that looks like. Liz Magor's Light Shed on Cole Harbor is a really interesting piece to stop by as well. She cast a full fisherman's shed, piece by piece, board by board, and then reassembled it. So if you're curious about the piece itself, like every single barnacle has been cast and then reformed. It's a really beautiful piece. Someone else who I'm very interested in terms of how they've developed survivalism and a relationship with architecture is Andrea Zittel. She kind of brings it to the next level because she not only develops dwellings, but she also lives her mantra. She makes a lot of her own clothes. She's developed a system of surviving in the world and living and occupying space that is concerned with minimal footprint, the use of materials in a really economical and mindful way. And so one of the things that she's done that I'm really curious about is her wagon station encampment. This is on land that she owns through her family near Joshua Tree. And you can see these little capsules that also have a really lovely aesthetic quality to them. What I love about it is that she's talking about it as a wagon station. So at the same token that you're thinking about something very contemporary, if not futuristic, you're also reminded of this colonial settler activity and developing the western part of the United States, of this wagon station progress through that land. Some of the things that I've been looking at recently that I think are really interesting architectural moments and that have been informing my work are things like observatories. I was super excited to see that TRU has an observatory. But also looking at things like Kitt Peak, where you have this real butting of heads between the formation of the landscape and these super hard angular objects that are very purposeful in terms of how they are built. They're built for their function, but they also provide a really interesting architectural moment within a soft-sided landscape. Some of the ways that I've been dealing with tenets or elements of survival is through the idea of that relationship between landscape and how we communicate through it. What we have here is a portion of a survival manual that deals with the subject of heliograph communication. And heliographs, the way they work is you're capturing light from the sun and you create a flare or a burst of light that when you interrupt it, you can send Morse code messages from vast distances. The early stories about Morse code through heliograph is that people who were looking to settle parts of Western North America couldn't figure out how First Nations communities were communicating across vast distances. They seemed to know about the arrival of wagon stations way before the actual physical arrival. And what's been found out is that mica surfaces were polished and used like a mirror with a language that was sent across really vast distances. So the project that I was doing to think about this idea of the heliograph further was that I actually went into Arizona in the area where the mica, the polished surfaces, were believed to be originally used. And I was sending Morse code messages through recorded video. This ended up in a show that I developed where I was interested in this idea of how we have historically looked at how the West has been won, and how that's depicted through things like pulp novels. So this idea of and trope of the stereotypical cowboy, the idea of the man's man, of land and man and animal being inseparable. And I'm really curious about these stories because I think it's a lot of the narrative that has been built around Western culture and how we kind of self-mythologize. So in this case, what I've done is I've got Morse code that's spread across novel covers. And these are larger printouts. So I'm scanning in the original novel cover, blowing them up, and then actually distressing them again so that they appear as the original novel cover. The gold leaf is a Morse code pattern that across the whole series spells out all of the letters to Home on the Range. So that's what you see across the series. I was interested in developing ways of thinking about heliograph maps. So this is one of the original maps of that area in Arizona where I was doing the performance with the mica shards. And just how beautiful and abstract, how futuristic those maps seem, even though they're talking about something that's centuries old. And then the video projection itself of the performance that I did in Arizona was employed by using a ceiling-mounted projector that was faced into a heliograph mirror and then reprojected back onto the wall. So it's using some of the same tools, like the mirror that I would have used for the performance, and restaging it within the gallery so that the projection itself was, in effect, a heliograph message.
How would the heliograph mirror be different from a mirror?
Oh, only because it's positionable. There's usually a tripod stand for it. As it was being developed and used within the military, they developed almost like a Venetian blind system for it, so that you could like quickly pop your dots and dashes. But for the most part, it functions through like cover. I mean, I used a ping pong paddle in a mirror, so that's very high tech. And this is just a still from the projection. Within the gallery, and this is something that I like to share with folks, is that scale is something, as I mentioned at the beginning, a really important way for me to be thinking about addressing something in the space of a body or addressing something as an idea. And so for me, within the gallery space, I was interested in creating full-scale architectural, or sorry, not architectural, but observational maps of the Morse code. But I also created little Morse code vignettes. So using books that were also part of the installation and miniatures, I set up stations that communicated with one another throughout the gallery. So these little lights would send signals to one another and blip back and forth. This is with Latitude 53 in Edmonton. Yeah, before they moved into their new space. I was one of the last shows that, yeah, it was such a great space. I mean, their new space is great too, but it was a really special location. We're getting into some of the stuff that I've done more recently now, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, so I am going to try and kind of speed through. I had the opportunity in 2014 to work with the Kent Harrison Arts Council, and I did a residency with them out in Harrison Hot Springs. They have a ranger station that they operate, and the residency is located within the ranger station. So it was a year-long project. I was within the ranger station. Half of it was studio, half of it was my living quarters, and it was historically a fully functioning ranger station. At the same time that I was living in the station, I was also looking into, again, the Lloyd Kahn architectural structures, thinking about these ideas and ways of looking at the land around you and inserting gestures, forms that respond to landscape in a really different way. So Kahn was somebody that I was looking at. Buckminster Fuller was really informative to the work that I was doing. And I think part of this, and what I found so fascinating, is that within the dome schematics, this is intended to be built within a 72-hour period. In the same way that a lot of the Kahn structures are meant to be a seasonal structure. So it goes up, you do all of your work, and it's completed within a season, which is a really different way of operating with construction. And that's something that I was thinking a lot about. I was also really interested in this time how Buckminster Fuller was partnering up with other artists to create visions of ideas of the future. So really responding to the zeitgeist of the 1960s, where you're thinking about what was the cultural climate at that point, and thinking about structures and moments that could project us into the future. I was also really interested in how most of these collaborations that he was doing, in particular with Shoji Sadao, these are analog pieces. So they're done through drawing, really meticulous work with photo manipulation or collage tactics to create a really believable image. And that trickery was something that I was really curious about and has informed my collage work. The show that I put forward at the end of the year was called Shelter. I was working in partnership with the Harrison Archives as well. And so a lot of the source material that I was thinking about was coming from their archive. One of the things that I found so interesting about the Harrison region is that the entire area was colonized originally for the hot springs, but stayed viable and important because of its relationship to lumber. And so again, a really different kind of economy than what we were looking at originally or the original intent of the place. I was developing bookworks along with some of the collage work that I started making. I've always been really interested in how bookworks can stretch out time. The looking experience of a bookwork has a really different cadence and flow than looking at a framed or a singular piece of work. And I was interested in how we could think about architectural plans, blueprints, as a way of a shortcut to that dialogue about architecture. Some of the work that I was also doing was print-based. Again, looking at what the natural flora, fauna occurring in the Fraser Valley region was doing. So I did a bit of research about what kind of plants were located in the area that also had food-based or medicinal-based properties to them. So thinking about how to make work that is site-responsive, rather than going into a residency and saying, I'm going to bring you the work that I already make, saying, how can I respond to and inform the place and be informed by where I'm going to be making work. These are layered silkscreen prints with collage moments on cotton rag paper.
Is there text on those?
Yes, yeah, there's a subtle layer of screen printed text, for sure. A lot of the work that I was doing was really my introduction into a deeper exploration of collage. I was looking really specifically at how to take work that I was printing myself or drawing myself and how to combine that work in a meaningful way with the archival footage, the archival images that I was exploring. And also how to create a bit of an unusual moment. How do you take something that seems very familiar because of its historicity? We've all seen archival photos like this that have kind of a sepia tone and they document some kind of Canadian agricultural moment. How do you interrupt that tacit knowledge that we have of those photos and that space with information that allows us to consider these spaces in a fresh way? And I think this is where I really started to discover the power and potential of collage to interrupt our understanding of images. Some of the miniatures that I was making were also a big part of how I installed work in the gallery. As I was in the ranger station, a significant portion of the shoreline trees that occupied that area were cut down. There were rumors about whether that was for sight lines for property owners or whether the trees were diseased. So what I ended up doing within the gallery was rescuing a significant portion of these stumps and using them as props rather than a traditional plinth for these miniatures. And again, a way of thinking about taking from some of the architectural moments of where I was and informing them with an idea of what this might look like in the future. So if we get into my contemporary collage work, stuff that's happening right now, one of the things that I like to let people know about is that I use a titling system that relates to the French conjugation of verbs. Exciting! I am bilingual, and for me what was really interesting about the idea of the term future tense is that it has sort of a funny dual meaning of that we can talk about verb conjugation, but it's also an interesting way to think about our psychological disposition around the future, the idea of it being tense. So futur simple, futur antérieur, futur proche, and infinitif are different verb tenses that have really helped me think about the collage work that I'm making. So the idea of what will happen, what will have happened, what will happen soon, and then what always happens. And they're all thinking about the future, but with different kinds of proximity. So within this series, I started making collage work up in Harrison, to be really super honest with you, because money was really tight. And collage is a way to operate with previously printed matter. And for me, as a printmaker, to be able to examine, like, how close can you get? How believable can you make this joinery or these two pieces that come from separate sources? If you start to look at, like, let's say how something was printed, the dot structure that it holds. If something was printed in the Midwest in the 1960s, the tonality of that printed matter is very different than if something was printed digitally in the 1990s. So what started out as a way to keep my practice fresh, even though I did not have a lot of money for things like cotton rag paper and paints and inks, actually ended up informing a lot of the work that I'm making right now. What I was also excited about was this opportunity to look at the past and the future simultaneously. So collage has this exquisite power of making us both nostalgic and dreamlike in the same moment. I was really excited about how placement, interruption, and intervention into those established, predictable image spaces could really be challenged through insertion of surprise elements, or looking at ways to integrate that were really exciting and creating new narrative. I like to share this image for people who aren't as familiar with how printed matter was made in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, because that's my bailiwick. Like that period of time is what my studio has in it. Most of the printed matter that I work with is done with a kind of dot structure that you could either call a Bende dot or a CMYK, like a 4-color separation dot. And when those dots come close together, they create different tonal ranges. So if you think about like your Archie comics, it's like Archie comics, but very tiny. So this is a way for me to talk about how I make decisions within collage too. I'm often looking with a microscope or a loupe to see, okay, what kind of tonal range is here? And if we've got that same kind of printing technology over here, it means that a lot of the color ranges, a lot of the shadows, how light falls within my source material is going to match up really nicely. Some of the studios that I'm looking at and the artists that I'm really interested in are also working in analog ways. So Super Studio Collective from the 1960s is working with analog collage. And what I'm interested in that they're doing is, this is through drawing, they're creating these beautiful shadows and drop highlights that really let us believe. So it's subtle moments and choices like that that allow us to suspend our disbelief of the collage. And if we look at how they've organized their images, they're really quite fantastical. Another artist that I'm really interested in, Tsunehisha Kimura. I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. I've been told I speak Japanese with a French accent. So one of the things that I'm also really interested in, how people were looking at collage before digital times. What is it in terms of cutting and splicing and dicing that allows us to create a really plausible image before we had the capacity to work within Photoshop? So I'm really trying to learn from people who have come before me. These are all analog collages. And they really start to also reflect my interest in post-apocalyptic landscapes. So what happens when we have homesteaded everything? What happens when we no longer have the opportunity to look at an image of a redwood forest and think about the spaces we have been, when that's no longer part of the contemporary landscape that we occupy? And I think this is a really interesting time to consider the fact that this was very important to artists looking at the world around them in the 70s, and we're butting ourselves up against it again. And so to look at how people have been dealing with that information and that imperative and making work around it. Science fiction plays into this in a major way. So thinking about plausible and implausible moments in the future. One of the things that I'm also really curious about with science fiction is novel covers, again. So if we think about the work that I was making with How the West Was Won, science fiction novel covers have been really informative in terms of how I'm looking at different moments within my contemporary collage work. And of course, printmaking. So the thing that I'm looking to printmaking for is the idea of landscape. One of the things that I'm really curious about is how within a historical landscape you have a stacked vision of both underground, above ground, foreground, midground, background being smushed into one vision or one image. And also how block coloring and gradient color gives this a kind of timeless feel. Even though the print date on this is 1833, that color palette is super now. And so thinking about how we can look at historical works with a contemporary lens. Yoshida's prints I find super inspiring, and I think you can see some of this way of building landscape coming forward with my collage work as well, this idea of the super foreground informing space and our participation in this landscape. The midground is a way of understanding what's going on around, and then that idea of prospect, of far landscape, giving us a sense of space. So within my own work, this is a series, the Futur d'Intérieur series, where I'm really thinking about that idea of building and constructing landscape from things that are super close to things that are quite far away. I'm inserting moments that make these landscapes fantastical so that we can have a conversation about how architectures are occupying this space. This series is about 2 feet tall by about 1.75 feet wide. Most of these collages are composites, so they're made from 20 to 80 individual pieces that I'm collaging together to create the whole. As I mentioned before, I'm looking at shadow, where light falls, to create a plausible image. And that's how a lot of these are coming together as a new whole. I'm also really interested in how the architecture that's being employed within these images can start to talk about some of the aspects that we've discussed in my earlier part of the presentation, so things like ruin, how architecture travels through time, how it becomes a way of discussing insertion into the land, colonialism. I'm also very interested with this collage work of creating a sense of upside down and right side up. With this particular set, which are going to be installed at Arnica, so if you have the chance, please come by tomorrow night for the opening. These are a set of collages where I'm looking at that idea of constructed landscape, of that stacked scroll, where you can see both the underside, the full-on view, the top, and then the very far away in the landscape in one particular stacked scroll. These are made from a smaller composition, scanned in, and then reassembled and printed out in a large format. And it's actually something that I've been really interested in terms of how I can take my experience within printmaking, looking at taking detailed moments, scanning them in, and then in some cases making them quite large.
So, because that was one of the questions I had, like, you're working with 80 different pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And would you be working on like a light table, or you just scan them into the computer and then you start working with them?
Everything's analog. So I do the construction entirely. I'm cutting everything by hand. I'm arranging it on a work table. And then, so some of the things, I'm just going to skip ahead to show this piece. The original collage for this is at the Arnica show. But what I've started to do is experiment with cutting and assembling a composition. And then I'll take apart all the pieces. I scan in the pieces, I enlarge them, and then I've reassembled this. So it's 74 inches, which is about my height, and it's about 50 inches wide. And so the original collage, the source material, is about this big. But when I'm scanning it in at high resolution, blowing it up and printing it out, I'm cutting out all those pieces again, and then reassembling so that it's a large wall piece. So the shadow that you see cast here is actually the shadow of the object away from the wall, if that makes sense.
So the aspects that you were talking about in relation to making something really tiny, it's like an idea, as opposed to having that physical presence.
Yeah.
That must be what you're experiencing when you do blow these up, because they are so precious.
For
when
sure.
you're working tiny like that, but
Yeah.
then they become an entity that you interact with.
Yeah, well, and what's so interesting about this, if we just flip back one slide, these are so tiny and so detailed. For me, they often take an extraordinary amount of time because I'm cutting everything by hand, usually with a straight blade. They feel precious. And what I'm interested in is that this becomes a space where you are projecting into it. You're looking at it and imagining what that space is like. Whereas when I'm transitioning to these larger scale forms, you really feel them with your body. Because of the organization of this material, it has a body-like structure. It has a slightly smaller head and a shoulder and hips to it. And so what I'm interested in with it is how people are interacting with it on a totally different psychological level because they don't have to imagine scale anymore. It's become really exciting to see how that shift can happen, but still maintain the kinship of collage activity with it.
Are most of them then quite small?
The collages all start small.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all start very small. And that's the nature of the source material that I'm working with, because it's the scale limitations of what I can build from the original material is what it's published at.
Which is usually no bigger than maybe what, 12 by 12?
Yeah, coffee table books are sort of the largest printed matter that I'm working with. Yeah. Just to make sure that we make it out of here on time, I'm sorry that we're running a little close to the clock. I did want to have a thank you slide, and we can flip back through the images if people are curious. I wanted to say a big thank you to Arnica Artist Rent Center for having me here, and also for TRU, Thompson Rivers University, for hosting the talk today. I usually list the organizations that I've had the opportunity to work with and that have helped fund my work. So if you're curious about any of the spaces that I've been able to partner with, please let me know. And then I also like to thank my partner and my parents, because a lot of this wouldn't have happened without them.